So let me ask, what is it? What is the phrase that young people use today when they want to challenge somebody to do something? When they want to, like back in the day, we would dare them, or if I bet you won't do it. Is that
You won't.
you just say you won't? If they anything else that's said, or is it just like the old days where they just say I dare you, or
Be more what's good.
be more what's good? What's that mean?
My definition, that's
All right. Because see, like way back in the day when I was like,
No more double dog there?
well, that was what I was going to say. Was back in the day, believe it or not, we would say I dare you or I double dog dare you. Now I have no idea what dogs had to do with daring, but like that was the most serious thing that could happen to you is for somebody to say to you in a group of people, I double dog dare you. You had to do it. Like for instance, I had a paper route in the northeast side of Indianapolis, and my paper route finished. The sun was going down, and I had to walk past the forest on 20th Avenue. Well, what you got to know is that 20th Avenue, there's a little creek, and the forest is grown up, so you can't see anything that's in there. And walking through there during the day is fine, but as the sun is going down, you can see like the security lights shining through, and you're walking by yourself, and yeah, it's just not, and so somebody might say, Caden, I double dog dare you to walk through the creek at 7 o'clock tonight. When I grew up in the country, there was up on the hill from where I lived, we had 5 acres of land. I mean, there's all kinds of farm land all around. And up at the top, there was a cemetery. It was an old Civil War cemetery. And it was during the day, it was nothing, man. You just walk right past it. But it was right creepy after the sun went down, right? And so someone would dare you to go at midnight and sit in the cemetery for 15 minutes, And now, there are always those kinds of things, and I don't know what they do these days, what people dare people to do, if there's anything that's actually scary around here, But the thing that happens is once you prove yourself, somebody will dare you to do something bigger. There's always something bigger. So you hang out at the cemetery. Well, then they say, the old mental asylum up on Wickham? Go hang out there at midnight, right? There's always one more, and it's always something bigger, yeah? And that's how you prove that you're not too afraid to do something. But the thing that's really hard to do, because what you're doing is you're proving yourself, right?
Right.
That's what someone's asking you to do. They're asking you to prove. Prove that you're brave. Prove that you're strong. Prove that you're quick. Prove that you're smart. Prove that you're whatever. They're asking you to prove yourself. But they never stop at that. They just keep asking you. Yeah? And so the problem is that as you get older, people stop asking you to prove that you're brave, and they start expecting you to prove a negative. Do you know what that is? See, prove a positive is for me to say, John, I want you to prove that there is plastic in the state of Maryland. Well, that's proven a positive because the only thing he's got to do is pick up his plastic cup. And he's proved that there's plastic in Maryland. But proving a negative is impossible.
Right.
All right? Caden, prove that there's no gold in the city of Baltimore. Well, you can't do it. You can't. You can prove that there is gold, but you can't prove that there isn't gold. Because no matter where you take us, no matter what you show us, there's always somewhere else it could be hidden. There's always somewhere else it could have been brought into the city. You can't prove a negative. Now, the reason that's important isn't about whether there's gold in Baltimore, because I'm certain there's some downtown. But the thing is when people start expecting you to prove a negative in your relationship. Like your girlfriend says, prove to me that you weren't flirting with that girl. Well, how do you do that? It's not possible. It's not possible. But she wants you to prove that you weren't flirting with some girl, right? Your friend, who maybe he's a bit off at times, but he really is your friend. And you know, he's quirky, but you love him. He's your buddy, right? He's your brother. And he says to you, prove to me that you don't laugh when other people make jokes about me being odd. Well, you can't prove that, right? Prove to me that you didn't tell that secret that I shared with you. I can't. See, that's the problem with having to prove stuff, is that most of the things in this life that we're asked to prove by others is impossible. And if you have a friend who thinks you betrayed them, proving that you didn't is a long, hard, oftentimes useless endeavor. A couple of thousand years ago, there lived this fellow by the name of Paul. Now, if you know anything about the church or about the Bible, you might know who Paul is. Sometimes he's referred to as the Apostle Paul. Sometimes he's referred to as Saint Paul. But most of the time, I just refer to him as Paul. But if I call him one of those other things, you know that I'm talking about the same guy, right? Now, Paul, he's Jewish, right? Now, this is really important. He's Jewish. He grew up Jewish. He studied the Jewish law. He studied the Hebrew Bible. I mean, he was Jewish through and through. He went to Jewish school. He became a Jewish leader. The religion is sometimes referred to as Judaism. Well, he was in Jerusalem, which was the center of their religion. It was the center of how they lived and their culture. And this guy, Paul, he was like an up-and-comer. And then he became a follower of Jesus. Now, he didn't stop being Jewish. He just started following Jesus, which changed how he lived. It changed what was most important to him. It changed, well, who he followed and what he did and what he valued. So Jesus, through the Holy Spirit who lived inside him, led him away from Jerusalem and to places where there weren't a lot of Jews, and to those cities where he started churches. Now, if you're not a Jew in the Bible, you're called a Gentile, right? So Jewish people and then everyone else. Sometimes the people from Israel, the Jewish people, they refer to all of us who aren't Jewish as Goyim, which just means the people or the nations, or it can sometimes be derogatory, but you get the idea, right? And so Paul, he starts reaching out to people and telling them about Jesus who are like us and not so much like the Jews in Jerusalem. Now, what you got to understand is in Jerusalem, there's only one church at the time, okay? It's not like there was a church on every corner or something. There's only one church in Jerusalem at the time, and it is made up 99.9% of Jews. Now, they all follow Jesus, but they're all Jews, right? But Paul, he goes out and he's telling people about Jesus, and they put their faith in Jesus, and the Holy Spirit of God comes to live inside them, and they form little churches, and guess what? They're not Jews. They're Gentiles. They're Gentiles, all of them. They're Gentiles. And so he has to come back, and he has to tell the people in Jerusalem about these churches and about what the Holy Spirit's doing. Now, we've spent a good bit of time over these, I was going to say over the months, but it's actually over the years. We've spent a good bit of time in the last couple of years talking about how God uses Paul to start these churches and stuff. And how even back in Acts chapter 15, the church in Jerusalem gave their blessing that Gentiles were becoming followers of Jesus. And it wasn't just a Jewish thing, right? But in Acts 21, Paul and some of his friends have to come back to Jerusalem where there's only one church and it's made up mostly of Jews, led by some of the original apostles, friends of Jesus, and by Jesus' brother, well, his half-brother named James. And Paul comes to report to the leaders of that church what the Holy Spirit has done in all these non-Jewish cities. And I want you to check this out with me. Actually, I want to start with Acts chapter 21. If you'll go through past the whole section, I think Patrice has broken it out for me. And I want you to start with verse 17. And if you want to look it up, I'm using the New Living Translation, okay? So, verse 17 of Acts 21, you ready? When we arrived, the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem welcomed us warmly. Okay, so far so good, right? They've come back from reaching people who aren't Jewish, and they see the Jewish brothers and sisters who are their family, and they welcome them warmly. All right, check it out. Verse 18, the next day, Paul went with us to meet with James, who's like sort of the head of the council that's the head of the church, right? And all the elders of the Jerusalem church were present. All right, so it's James and it's the elders, the leaders, the church in Jerusalem. And verse 19, after greeting them, Paul gave a detailed account of the things God had accomplished among the Gentiles through his ministry. After hearing this, they praised God. Great. He's told them what the cool things have happened, and they're excited because that's what should happen. When you see somebody's life transformed by the love of Jesus, when they have a new purpose to their life and a new direction and those sorts of things, people should get excited, right? Well, that's exactly what happens. They get excited. Everything is good so far, right? Next. Ready? And then they said, you know, dear brother, how many thousands of Jews have also believed, and they all follow the law of Moses very seriously. This is the place where if you are any good at all about reading between the lines, you can think to yourself, uh-oh, something's wrong. Did James just casually power up in talking with Paul? Paul tells him about the little churches he started, and he responds by saying, there are thousands of people in this church, and they're all pretty serious about the law of Moses. And then here it comes, right? Not only is he just, and for those of you who don't know, who haven't been around pastors before, one of the ways that pastors kind of size each other up is when they introduce each other, they tell what church they're from, and then they tell how big the congregation is. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, pastors are good people. They are. But we're just people, you know, and we want to feel important. And pastoring a church of 2,000 makes you feel more important than pastoring a church of 5, you know? And so James says, you know that there are thousands of people who have become followers of Jesus here, and they all follow the Jewish traditions. And then here it comes. Are you ready? Verse 21. But the Jewish believers here in Jerusalem, this is still James talking, right? But the Jewish believers here in Jerusalem have been told that you are teaching all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn their backs on the laws of Moses. They've heard that you teach them not to circumcise their children or follow other Jewish customs. What should we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. Now press the pause button, okay? Now just so you can get a feel for what's going on here, okay? I'm just trying to imagine this. Some of you know that I was on sabbatical for a little while, right? Some of you know I was on sabbatical for about 6 weeks. Imagine this. Imagine while I'm gone, a rumor spreads through the church that I don't love Jesus anymore, that I don't believe in generosity, and I don't believe in serving our community anymore. That rumor spreads through the church. Now, here's the first thing I want to ask. Wouldn't you expect that somebody who knows me would say, whoa, I've known the man for 8 years, and he does not have it together in any way, shape, or form. But I can tell you, he loves Jesus. Don't get me wrong, I could tell you he is really bad at administration, but we can't get him to keep money in his pocket to save his life. He believes in generosity. Even when the rest of us are kind of scratching our heads about having mission teams come in, he's lining them up so that we can serve people in the community. I mean, wouldn't you expect that there would be people who would know me, who would simply stop the conversation and go, no way, that's not Ron. I don't know who you're talking about, but no. And he didn't lose his faith in 6 weeks. See, that's what I can't figure out here. See, some of these people have known Paul ever since he was a follower of Jesus. Some of these people have been to visit with Paul in the places where he started churches. Some of these people know that he starts out in every place he goes, he finds a synagogue where he can, so he starts with Jews to talk about Jesus. In fact, we just talked about, well, it's been a couple months now, but we talked about how when he took a vow, he made the trip all the way back to the temple in Jerusalem so he could fulfill his vow. Not because the law required it, but because he was a Jew, and that's what Jews do. And so, when I read this, I find myself going, where are all the people who know Paul? The only thing I can figure, and this is just a guess on my part, but if that were to happen in the 6 weeks I was gone, and no one was to object and say anything, I would assume it was because everyone thought it was possible. Everyone thought it was true. I mean, just listen again, all right? Just try to imagine this. Paul has come all this way. He's told them all this stuff. Look at verse 20 and 21 again. This is James talking to him. He says, but the Jewish believers here in Jerusalem have been told. By whom? Who has told the Jewish believers that you are teaching all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn their backs on the law of Moses? They've heard, again, I ask, they've heard by whom? Listen, I can tell you as a pastor, I've been pastoring for about 32 years now. One of the most frustrating things is when somebody pulls you to the side and says, listen, there's some people who are talking and I've heard. And when you go, really? What are their names? Oh, I don't think it would be right for me to tell you who they are. You know, that will just absolutely make you crazy. It'll make you wish God had called you to sell used cars. I'm telling you. It will just make you crazy, right? Who is telling them this stuff? And where are the people who should be standing up saying, Paul is a Jew? In fact, later on in one of his letters, get this, in one of his letters, he declares to everyone, I am a Hebrew of Hebrews, of the tribe of Benjamin. You know what he's saying? I am as Jewish as it gets, brother. And I love Jesus, and I'm not disregarding the Hebrew Bible. I just see it in a different way. Right? Nobody stands up. Nobody defends the man. And the fear is almost palpable. You hear it there, right? What should we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. And if they're not afraid, then that's political maneuvering. I mean, there may be another option, don't get me wrong, and you guys think of it, you let me know, okay? But that seems to be what's happening. And listen, I don't want you to misunderstand me. James is the man, all right? Seriously. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking a little bit more about James, and you're going to find out how much of the man he really is, the half-brother of Jesus. But even James can get upside down. Everybody else can, right? James can be just as human. Remember, we've seen Paul mess up before. Paul's not perfect. There's only one who's perfect, and that's Jesus. So we can't be thrown off too much if we're reading about one of the main leaders of the church having a really bad day, you know? And so, verse 23, again, this is James talking to Paul. Here's what we want you to do. We have 4 men here who have completed their vow. Go with them to the temple and join them in the purification ceremony, paying for them to have their heads ritually shaved. Then everyone will know that the rumors are all false, that you yourself observe the Jewish laws. Now, we've talked about this before. There's something called a Nazirite vow. And that's when you get serious about making a promise to God about something. And one of the ways you seal that vow, one of the ways you establish that you are pursuing this thing, whether it's, purity or coming closer to God or sharing the God. It could be anything in your relationship with God. They would do 3 things without fail. 3 things. They didn't shave their hair. They let their hair grow long. They didn't drink alcohol. They didn't let it touch their lips. And they didn't touch anything dead. So a relative could pass away. They didn't touch them. They didn't come in contact with anything dead. Now, once they finished the vow, just like Paul did that one time, what they would do is they would make their way to Jerusalem. They would come into the temple for this purification tradition, and then they would pay to have their hair shaved once their vow was fulfilled. And all that long hair would be taken and it'd be thrown into the fire as a permanent sacrifice, a way of saying, okay, the vow is over. Now, one of the things that the vow did, especially if you were growing your hair long, one of the things it did was it told people that you and God had something going on that you couldn't talk about or you wouldn't talk about. But if people saw that your hair was getting longer, they would be careful about, not offering you alcohol or not asking you to help bury a family member, because there were no funeral homes back in the day or that kind of thing. It was just a way for people to know that something intense was happening with you and God, but you couldn't talk about it, right? So they make this vow, and so the leaders have offered Paul a test. Here it is. Did you catch what they said at the very end? Then everyone will know that the rumors are all false and that you yourself observe the Jewish laws. Okay, for those of you who have forgotten, there are over 613 Jewish laws just regarding the Ten Commandments. 613. So, did they really believe that if Paul goes and does this thing, pays to have these guys' hair cut, that everyone is going to go, oh, whew, everything's okay. Paul is still a Jew. Everything is fine. I didn't understand, but now I got it. Everything is good. We can go back to work now. Paul knows this isn't going to work. But look what happens. Paul is way smarter than me, and I can see it from 1,000 feet away. This is not going to work. Taking a bunch of guys to the temple, having their heads shaved, and paying for it is not going to prove that you're following all the Jewish laws and traditions. It just isn't. It just isn't. And I know that Paul can see that. And so that's why this part blows my mind. Just listen to this, okay? Verse 26. So, Paul went to the temple the next day with the other men. They'd already started the purification ritual, so he publicly announced the date when their vows would end and sacrifices would be offered for each of them. The 7 days were almost ended when some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple and roused a mob against him. They grabbed him, yelling, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who preaches against our people everywhere and tells everybody to disobey the Jewish laws. He speaks against the temple and even defiles this holy place by bringing in Gentiles." For earlier that day, they had seen him in the city with Trophimus, a Gentile from Ephesus, and they assumed Paul had taken him into the temple. The whole city was rocked by these accusations, and a great riot followed. Paul was grabbed and dragged out of the temple, and immediately the gates were closed behind him. As they were trying to kill him, word reached the commander of the Roman regiment that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately called out his soldiers and officers and ran down among the crowd. When the mob saw the commander and the troops coming, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander arrested him and ordered him bound with 2 chains. He asked the crowd who he was and what he had done. Some shouted one thing and some another, and since he couldn't find out the truth in all the uproar and confusion, he ordered that Paul be taken to the fortress. As Paul reached the stairs, the mob grew so violent the soldiers had to lift him to their shoulders to protect him, and the crowd followed behind, shouting, "Kill him! Kill him!" Yeah, that went pretty well. So we're going to stop here, but let me just make 3 or 4 observations, okay? Just from that last section. I don't get why Paul agreed. The only thing I can think, and this is just my take, okay? The only thing I can think is that he chose to humble himself to the leadership of the church in Jerusalem, to show that he hadn't become big-headed, to show that he hadn't gone rogue or something. That's the only thing I can figure, is that even though it was obvious it wasn't going to work, he submitted to their leadership. The second thing, and one of the keys for people who are self-righteous or experiencing what is referred to as righteous indignation, is a thing called evidence bias. You know what evidence bias is? It's when you come to a conclusion and then you go look for the evidence to prove your conclusion. Instead of taking the evidence and letting the evidence lead you to a conclusion, you come to a conclusion. And then you just pick and choose until you convince yourself that you're right. So this group that starts the riot, what do? They see Paul, and they remember that they saw Paul earlier in the day out in the market, not in the temple, out in the market with some guy from Ephesus, which makes him a Gentile, and they jumped to the conclusion, they assumed, that's verse 29 says, they assumed that he had brought a Gentile into the temple and defiled the temple. Now, the third thing, and this is interesting to me, the riot is moved to outside the temple. The gates are closed. The city is in an uproar. The Roman commander receives word. He gets his men together, and once they appear, the beating of Paul stops. That takes a bit of time, don't you think? From the time when Paul first is attacked until word gets up the hill and they get back down the hill and can stop the mob. I mean, that takes a little while, right? So first of all, just for those of you who want to know, Paul is not a powder puff. He's taken a beating that whole time. He's taking a beating the whole time. And here's the question. Where were the thousands of followers of Jesus? I mean, whether they thought he was doing right or not, he was one of their brothers, right? James said there are thousands who believe in Jesus. Where were they? Don't tell me they didn't have time, because the captain of the Roman guards had time. The whole city was supposed to be uproar. Where was the church? And then lastly, and this one I just think is just fascinating, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of Baltimore. Paul gets arrested. Of all things, Paul gets arrested. There's a couple hundred people beating on him, but it's Paul who gets put in chains, and he's the one who gets arrested. So there are so many things we could talk about here. I mean, we could talk about how this is just proof. This is proof that the church has always had problems. We've always had challenges because we're human beings, and we're flawed, and we're broken, and we make sometimes really big mistakes. So when you hear somebody say, oh, I wish we'd go back to the original church where they, had it all together and they never made any mistakes. Well, just look at Acts chapter 21. I mean, that's a pretty big mistake, right? Or maybe we could talk about just how we're supposed to defend one another, how we're supposed to be family, but that's not what I want to leave you with tonight. At the time of that riot, at the time of Acts 21, Paul has 5 years left to live. He'll die about 62, 63 AD. This is about 58-ish, right? He'll go from place to place. There'll be more people who try to kill him. There will be more people who will beat him. There will be more times when he will be in danger of his life over and over and over and again. And when he gets to the end of his life in about 63 AD, the Emperor Nero will order him beheaded. That's what tradition has. Will order Paul beheaded because he's a follower of Jesus. Not because he's a Jew. He'll have him killed because he's a follower of Jesus. Now, some people think, and I happen to be one of them, that about 5 months before he was beheaded, Paul wrote a letter to somebody he was really close to. His name was Timothy. He was a spiritual son. In fact, we have that letter. It's the last letter of Paul's in existence. 2 Timothy. And I want you to listen to this because I think this is worth me taking you through all that. Are you ready? Paul wrote to his spiritual son and he said, work hard so you can present yourself to God and receive His approval. Be a good worker, one who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly explains the word of truth. You know, for some of us, it takes longer to learn this lesson than for others. But here it is, okay? In this life, you don't have to prove anything to anybody except God. Just God. That's the only one you ever have to prove anything to. You don't have to prove anything to your bosses. You don't have to prove anything to your extended family. You don't have to prove anything to your high school buddies that you hadn't seen in 30 years. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, which is really good news. Because the only one that you can actually prove something to is God. Because He knows your heart. He knows your desires. Nobody else does. Nobody else can read your mind. Nobody else can know what you really wanted to have happen. No one else will believe you about certain things. But God, because He knows, He's the one. He's the one that you can prove yourself to. Because He's on your side. And I hope you guys think about that, okay?